Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Paul Wilson. Tonight we're talking about the lost towns and villages of the Isle of Wight. So we've got a lot to go through tonight, and so I might have to whiz through stuff. Well, we'll just wait and see how I go. Oh, there we go. So we'll start off with an introduction, and then we're going to talk about these places. Fleshland. Who's heard of Fleshland? Maybe. Wolverton. Who's heard of the curse of Moortown? Yeah. What about Thorncross, the secret of Thorncross? Who knows about that?
Thorny Cross now.
Sorry?
Isn't that Thorny Cross?
Oh, maybe. What about Knighton, when Knighton died? Who knows about that? Yeah. Truth about Rolin? Yeah. And Queen's Bower, or Queen's Bower we call now, but Queen Bower, or Queen Dower, as it was once known, and the Devil's Stones. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Once we get through that, we can then take a few questions and have a bit of a discussion if you feel like it. But so we'll move on. Now, I always worry about putting this into slide mode. I always have, it starts moving windows and things around. So I'll just do it this way. So they say that the island is the most haunted place in Britain. Who's heard that before? The old people say that you can't go around a corner without meeting a ghost or a shade. Ghosts are not always the domain of the lost long ones, but actual places. Places can be just as ghostly as people who were once flesh and blood. Tonight we'll explore the stories and the places lost to time, but lest the spectral mark that leave the spectral mark on our island. There's a typo there, I should have read that. I did it really quickly. Today was a bit of one of those days where I got rushed off my feet. I had to end up kind of pick up my children. One of them fell down and hurt themselves, and so I didn't get anything done, so I didn't proofread it. So I'm very sorry if there's typos. But so that's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about those places that have slipped between this world and the other. In some people say it's gone to the Somewhen. Who's heard of the Somewhen?
Yeah, I use that all the time.
Not just a saying, it's a place. And they call it the Somewhen for a really, really interesting reason. Because it's not like you might slip in to a different place, but you might even slip to a different time. You might go back in time. You might slip in, come back yesterday. Or you might come back tomorrow. But in a lot of cases, you don't come back at all. So the other place, the Somewhen. So we're going to talk about these places. The island, like all places, is moving and changing. And the towns and the villages and the roads that we know today were not the roads that we knew yesterday. They won't be the roads and places and towns and villages that we know tomorrow. So we're going to talk about these places that are sort of slipped away. Some of the biggest, most prosperous towns on the island just disappeared off the face of the earth. And we know that they were there because we've got records of them. And some of them we know have changed names, but again, have disappeared. And we also know by looking at maps and satellite imaging, we can see where some of these places were. Some of the towns and And actually, if you go exploring in some of these places, you can actually find the old walls, find the old streets. So that's what we'll be talking about. So let's start with Fleshland. Somewhere between God's Hill and Bathingbourne is the lost hamlet of Fleshland. The cunning folk, they call it Fleshland, for the beast that once resided there. Should have been a C there. I will fix this. That is where Fleshland used to be. That copse there. That's on the other side is called Fleshland Farm. And that road is called Fleshland Lane. They used to call it Fleshland. And they called it Fleshland, and they still do. The old cunning folk of the island still do. Who's heard of the mumpocker? The mumpocker. Mm. No? Well, let me tell you the story of Fleshland. So the story goes that the little hamlet of Fleshland, sleepy little place, quiet, out of the way. It was in a laneway off in the middle of nowhere. Not a place that was visited very often, but a tightly knit little community. As you can see, it wasn't very big. 5 or 6 maybe little houses, probably tumble down little houses. I suspect they didn't have much, but it probably resided on both sides of the road there. But they were haunted, so it said, by a creature, a monster that had been driven out of God's Hill. Now, before God's Hill was God's Hill, before it had the church, you know this story? I'll just refresh people's memories for those that don't know or can't remember. Before God's Hill had a church, it was a tiny hamlet as well. And it was built on marshy, swampy land. There's 3 versions of this story. First version says that to bring themselves closer to God, they decided they were going to build a church. And they built that church. And because the people that built it were so pious, they built it down on low ground in the swamp. But because those people were so pious, that an angel came down and picked up the church and put it up on the hill. That's one version. Version number 2 is the one that most people know. When they decided to build their church, a demon or a devil, or maybe it was Satan himself, came along and tried to convince everyone to build the church in the swampland. And he did that because he knew it would fall into the swamp. And eventually he had them fooled. He had the people of God's Hill fooled. But then a great saint came along. Now, in some stories, It's St. Boniface. In some stories, it's just an unknown saint who comes along and, using the word of God, scares away the devil, and then uses his saintly powers to help the people move the foundations up on the hill, safe away from the swamp. And there's some variations on that. And the third story talks about the mumpoker. Now, the mumpoker, they say, was an old woman. She was an old woman who never had any children, whose husband left her at an early age with nothing. He was a drinker and a gambler, and so left her with nothing. She grew old, living in a ramshackle building out in the swamps. And as she grew old, the hamlet that would become God's Hill sprung up around her. And as the years went by, she became more and more bitter, more and more resentful of these people that came to live near where she was. And one day she decided she'd had enough. So she called on an imp or a devil and said, I want to do a deal. I want these people gone. How do we get rid of them? And the imp says, okay, I'll do you a deal. I'll make sure I get rid of these people. But you then have to do my bidding. And she was an old woman. She thought, how much mischief could she get up to? She just wanted to live in her little hovel. She wanted to be surrounded by her bitterness. And she knew that death was just around the corner. So she thought she had it made. So she agreed. And so the imp went to the people of the hamlet, which would become God's Hill, convinced them that they didn't want to live around in this swamp. And they should move. Now, while all this was going on, the mumpoker, or the old woman, quietly waited her turn, waited her time, bided her time, waiting her turn to reclaim her swamp, her marshland. But something happened to throw a bit of a spanner in the works. The pesky old saint, whoever he was, maybe it was St. Boniface, maybe it was, who knows, maybe it was St. Urian, came along, got rid of the imp, helped the people to build their church on top of the hill. And the mumpoker, the old woman, bitter, spitting, angry, tried to poison the waters, tried to poison the wells. Fortunately, that pesky old saint was still around and chased the mumpoker out. And she took off. But she thought, well, my time's nearly up. But she'd already done her deal. She'd done her deal with the imp. And the imp popped up before her and said, look, we had a deal. I got the people to move from the swamp, didn't I? He said, no, you didn't. He said, I did. They're not there anymore. She said, yeah, maybe they're gone. They've just gone up the hill and I've been thrown out. He said, too bad. A deal's a deal. She said, okay, what can you make me do? I'm an old, weak, feeble old woman who's near death. And the imp suddenly turned on her and said, from this day forth, you are mine and you will not die. You will live in the nightmares of all children on the Isle of Wight. She was sent as far away as she could walk or waddle during the day. She ended up in Fleshland, sat at what was, back then, a crossroads. You can see where the laneway turns around. You can see the remainders of the crossroad here. Crossroads went like that and went like that. And there she sat, weeping for the things that she'd lost and weeping in her bitterness. And every time a person came by to speak to her, she would take the child away, never to be seen again, until eventually there was no one left in Fleshland. And that is why the old people call it Fleshland, because the mum poker would take those children and remove their flesh from their bones. I'm not going to go there and find out, but you're welcome to. Yeah. That's the story of Fleshland. Wolverton. There are two places on the island called Wolverton. Well, there were. Everyone knows of Wolverton Manor. Funny old place, the Isle of Wight, really. There's always two of everything, isn't there? Yeah. Weird old place. We're not talking about Wolverton Manor. We're talking about the town called Wolverton. The mysterious town that disappeared. And we know Wolverton existed. We've got those records. We know it was prosperous. We know that it had very, very special holy well. Now they say the water from the holy well never spoiled and never went off. They say that it ran clear even in the hottest of summers, when every other well would run almost dry and murky and muddy. The well of Wolverton and the stream, there's a stream that ran through it, would always run clear and cool. And their prosperity grew. Now, we know that this was Wolverton. This little bit that jutted out here, that used to be a pier. That's where the ships would come in. Because all that was called Brading Haven. That was all a big bay there before it all silted up. And this line here, it's called Wolverton Road, was. It's now called Centurion's Copse. Now, people think it's called Centurion's Copse because of some connection with Romans and Roman centurions. It's called Centurions after the great church that was in the middle here, St. Urian's. Who's St. Urian? No one really knows. There's no mention of a St. Urian. Maybe it's a derivation of St. Uriel. Who knows? But we have records that there was a church called St. Urian's there. And in fact, on the very first Ordnance Survey map, they've got a big cross there. It says the Chapel of St. Urian's. It's in the wrong place, but they've got the chapel sort of placed here, but it's not there. And if you're brave enough and you go off the beaten path, you can actually find your way to where the church was. And you'll walk through dense, dense trees, marshy land. There's a stream that runs through, that runs clear, even on the hottest of days. And that stream runs down here, runs into here, runs right through. You follow it through and you run through this, go through this dense forest. And all of a sudden, you'll be confronted with an earthwork 7, 8, 9 feet high, maybe. And it is dead square. And it's the length of the church. And that's where St. Urian's was. If you keep wandering around, you'll see where the roads were, if you're brave enough. You can even find stones. When you look at those stones, they're strange. They're blackened stones. And that's where our story ends. So let's wind back a little bit. Wolverton was an extremely prosperous town, run by very greedy people, and all the people were very greedy and happy in their prosperity. Wolverton had this amazing holy well, the well dedicated to St. Urian. And right next to that well, there was a stone. And on that stone was, "While the water flows pure and free, Wolverton shall happy be. The net be heavy in the sea, and wheaten seed shall yield plenty. When stains of blood burns the well, then Culver's Ness shall ring its knell." Culver's Ness, what's that? Well, sorry? No, Culver's Ness was where Culver is. There was an outcrop that came out like that, and it came in. So where the cliff face is now, it used to come right out. And that was Culver's Ness. So this was on a stone of prophecy, if you will. Anyway, the people of Wolverton grew lazy and rich. They quite liked it that way. They had a road that would come straight, so you go up the road from Yaverland, and then you hit the T intersection that then goes round to Culver. Well, that road would actually continue on. That was a crossroads there. And if you actually look from a satellite image, you can see where the crossroads used to be. It's clearly there. And that crossroads take you straight down here into Wolverton. And they didn't like that. They didn't like the people of Yaverland. They didn't have a church. Poor people. The only thing they liked about Yaverland was the manor there, because the High Sheriff the high commander of the Isle of Wight, he was there. But the people, not so much. They were selfish, they were lazy, and they were rich, and that's how they liked it. So they decided, well, you know what we're going to do? We're going to get rid of that road. And that's exactly what they did. They basically dug up the road and made sure that no one could come straight through. They'd have to go round Culver and come in the back way, because they didn't want the Yavelin people coming to their church or getting wind of their magic water or any of that sort of stuff. As I said, they became lazy. One day a man turned up. Now, normally what would happen is any visitors that would come to Wolverton would come in from this side, from left, or by boat. Or through the right-hand side, through the road. But this man just sort of turned up, came through the woodland trees that they put up, and he was there. He seemed like a tinker or a merchant of some sort. He had all sorts of wondrous things. Tonics, jewels, wonderful fabrics. But he never asked for any money from them. And they knew him by the name of Samuel. And every few months he'd turn up, never taking a penny, but always saying, one day I'll come back and you'll do something for me. And they were happy with that. And that went on for many, many, many months. So one day Samuel turned up and he said, the time has come. I need you to do something for me. What can we do? They were all a bit worried, a little bit ominous. And he said, look, don't worry, it's all right. I've had a vision, he said. I've had a vision of a man, and he will come in battered, scruffy clothes. And he will come via the old road, the dust, and he will be dusty and he will be dirty. And he will fulfill that prophecy. He is here to ruin your well. So when he comes, you must stop him. That sounded pretty easy, they thought. Now, there was one person in Wolverton, a young lad, who was not like the others. Now, some say that he was an orphan and had been taken in by the priests and was very pious. And he heard this story and he said, look, don't listen to that guy. There's something sketchy about him. They all laughed at him. Look, he brought us jewels. He brought us tonics. He brought us wonderful clothes. He said, yeah, but he hasn't asked for any money. They said, look, if you want to be a stick in the mud, that's fine. You go off and do whatever you want to do. We're going to stick with this dude because he's not steered us wrong. Now, this pious chap, he every Sunday would take a bowl of the communion and go to the people of Yavelin and give them communion. He would tend to the sick. He was a very generous young man. But he was not an idiot. He was not a stupid boy. So when our friend Samuel decided to leave, he left after making the deal with everyone, our pious friend decided to try and follow him. And he followed him and he followed him. But every time he tried to follow him, he sort of disappeared. Then he noticed, now if you can imagine Culver for a moment, you know the main road that takes you up the top. On the left, on the far side, there's a little laneway. You'll have seen it when you're driving around. You drive up the hill, you start coming up the hill, and it sort of go around like that. There's a tiny little laneway. That's called Samuel's Lane. And he noticed that Samuel quickly dodged up there. So our pious friend, Thomas was his name. I should have said that earlier. Thomas followed him. But again, Samuel disappeared. He got as far as the Culver Ness and disappeared. So Thomas went on about, as normal, every week ministering to the people in Yavelin, taking communion, helping the sick, helping them read the Bible. And one of these Sundays, he left early with his pot and went off to Yavelin. Later in that day, a man was seen walking where the old road had been. Dusty, unkempt, a brown cloak, ripped and old, with a staff. The people of Wolverton immediately knew who this person was. And as soon as he got in there, they chased him with sticks. They picked up anything they could. They got stones and they threw stones. The man ran for his life, and he ran further and further into Wolverton till finally they got him cornered. They hit him with sticks and they pelted him with rocks until finally he lay there, blood-soaked. He looked up at them and he said, "I'm a priest from the Holy Land. I have heard about your miraculous well and came only to bless it." The people of Wolverton, realizing that they'd been duped, picked him up and took him to the well, went to wash him off. And a single drop of blood fell into the well. And as it did, the well started to collapse in on itself. The prophecy had been fulfilled. And this is where the story gets really interesting. The well started to collapse in on itself. And then, and we know that this actually happened because we have the records, the French came in. The French, who had been sitting out, decided it was their turn to come in, and they burnt Wolverton to the ground. The people of Wolverton, lazy, unkempt. They hadn't trained. They hadn't kept their defenses up. They were too interested in keeping the people from Yavelin out. They'd forgotten about the other side. Now the warden of the island came galloping in. He came in with his forces and they fought back the French. But it was too late. Wolverton was ablaze. And the Lord of Yavelin was killed. And we know that happened. The records show that this happened. Our young friend Thomas, hearing in the distance and seeing the black smoke rising, started to walk back, and he came up over the hill from where the old road was. And he could see Wolverton ablaze. And to his right, standing at the bottom of Culver, was Samuel, laughing like a bell. His laugh rang out like a pealing bell. Thomas took chase, ran after him. Samuel saw him coming, and off he went. There was a second part of the prophecy that our friend Samuel had forgotten. Culver's nest shall ring its bell. Culver's nest fell into the sea that day, and it happened. Part of Culver Nest is still there now. If you go there at low tide, you can see the jagged rocks from Culver's Nest. And because Culver's Nest had fallen down, Thomas could see where Samuel had been, could see where Samuel was going. Samuel had a cave. There was a cave in the side of Culver's Nest. Thomas quickly went in and followed him in. And when he got in there, it was a great cavern. And out came Samuel, red, demonic. And he said, and as Thomas looked around the room, he saw that there were paintings all around the wall, and these were all the people that Samuel had done a deal with, all painted on their walls, but frozen in horror. Thomas looked, said to Samuel, "Who are you?" "Who do you think I am?" he said. "Are you Satan?" "No," he said, "not Satan. But you may know me by my other name, Samael." Now, Samael is another angel, and Samael means the venom of God. And Samael said to Thomas, "Why don't you sit down? Sit down." And magically in front of him was a table filled with food and drink. Thomas sat down, but as he sat down, he looked over in the corner. And in the corner was one space left, where a painting was slowly starting to appear. And he recognized the clothes. So Thomas stood, threw everything on the floor, cast Samael back, saved himself, and as he did, the middle of the cavern fell in, and all we ended up with was a small cave. Thomas then devoted his life to being a hermit. Who's heard of the hermit cave at Culver? And that is where the name came from. But there's another little bit of a story on this. Our friends from Yaverland, they noticed what was going on. There's a church at Yaverland, we all know that church, dedicated to St. John the Baptist. Now, the story goes that as the fires started to come down, the people of Yaverland prayed to St. John the Baptist to intercede on their behalf. And he made the remains of St. Urian's church light enough for them to pick up, take on along the old road and place where it is today. And you might say, that's just a wives' tale. But here's the thing. There was no church in Yaverland. Not until the medieval period. But there's parts of that church, there's an arch in that church that predates the church ever being built there. There have been Anglo-Saxon carvings found underneath the church that shouldn't be there. There's a bowl that's 300 or 400 years older than that church, a Christian bowl, but one that shouldn't be there. So you tell me, did the story happen or not? I like to think so. And that's the story of Wolverton. I'm just keeping an eye on time. Yes. In the 1500s. Moortown, Curse of Moortown. We've got to speed it up. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. Curse of Moortown. The people of Bryston were said to be arrogant and overly sanctimonious and looked down upon the people of Moortown. Who's heard that? They are, aren't they? Probably still are today. Moortown still turns up on our maps. There's a part of Bryston called Moortown now. There's an estate there. But yeah, the map shows where Moortown was. It actually was higher up than the place that they call it now. Let's talk about this. So there were two towns, or two villages at the time, Bryston and Moortown, hamlets really. And the bishop came, and the bishop said, look, we've got enough money to build one church. You're responsible people, you're adults. Work out between the two of you where it will be. You may want to build it between the two and share it. Seems like a good compromise, does it not? People of Bryston were having none of that. Those loathsome, poor, stupid people from Moortown, they lived in the poorer part. The land was not as good as theirs. No, they couldn't let Moortown have a church. So the bickering went backwards and forwards. Moortown's trying to give, saying, look, we'll have it in the middle. It doesn't have to be here. We'll happily walk down, we'll walk as far as we have to. Bryston were having none of it. In fact, they got to the point where Moortown were like, yeah, okay, look, you can have it just inside Bryston's border. No, Bryston were having none of it. They didn't want Moortown to have anything to do with their new church. So in the middle of the night, they went to Moortown, they burnt it to the ground. Burnt every person. Burnt every house. Scorched the land in an act of unprecedented violence. In doing so, they solved the problem, or so they thought. Now, our friend, the bishop, heard what happened. Now, the bishop was not a man to be suffered lightly. He had to build this church. And now that Moortown didn't exist anymore, he had to build it in Bryston. And he did. And they built that church. But on the day of consecration, he turned around to everyone and he said, no one, not one of you, has shown any remorse for what you have done. And because of that, no one will ever be able to take confession here. And because of that, your free running water that runs through the middle of Bryston will be poisoned. Poisoned by your own sins. And he walked away. And he made the decree that no one could take communion in that church until their sins had been washed away. And when he left, the next morning, the people of Bryston woke up to an ugly worm, an ugly giant dragon that sat there spitting in their water supply, turning it black with its venom, turning the people to disease. And as time went by, this dragon fed on their sins. And the story goes that finally, after many, many years, as Bryston was just hanging on by a tiny thread, a young boy finally had worked out what was going on, and he said he was sorry. And he prayed and said he was sorry. And he asked for forgiveness for the sins of the people of Bryston. And you see, the bishop couldn't really stop them taking confession. He couldn't really do that. But it needed the innocence of this boy. And when he did, not a day later, a saint came to Bryston. Now, they say his name was St. Tarquin, another one of these mysterious saints that we find out about on the island. There's no record of a St. Tarquin. But St. Tarquin came and he saw what was going on, and he cast out the dragon. And we ended up with the dragon tree. The dragon wreathed and swayed and turned into the great tree that is now on the beautiful, clear, clean waters of Bryston. But alas, Moortown was never again. So that's the story of the disappearance of Moortown. The secrets of Thorncross. Thorncross. Who's been to Thorncross? Anyone? Does anyone even know where it is? Nope. It's a very small place. In fact, there's nothing left of what was the hamlet of Thorncross. I'm just looking at the time, so I'm going to have to whiz through this. Thorncross was very, very special. And it was special because it had something holy. They said it was the site of a holy relic. The people of Thorncross let their treasure be stolen in the night, and the hamlet paid the price. It was said Thorncross, in the center of the old crossroads, which basically ran around here. And if you go there today, you can see where the old road used to run. Was a little shrine. And in that shrine, they say, was a thorn from the crown of Christ. And people would come from miles around to see this holy relic. One prick of the thorn would cure you of leprosy, he said. And the people of Thorncross were very proud of their relic. But as time went by, they became complacent. And one day, a man came along and offered them money. No, we wouldn't sell this. It's priceless. He offered them more money in gold. No. It's priceless. And at night, they made sure they guarded the thorn, because, they didn't want anyone running off with it. And there was a man whose job it was to look after this thorn. Now, the man that turned up realized that this poor chap, his whole life was basically spent staying up all night watching the thorn and then going to bed during the day. That's not a life. So he offered him money and he offered him gold to have a sleep that night. And he said, look, I promise you, I just want to be in the presence of the thorn. So the guard went off with his ill-gotten gains, and instead of going and having a nap, he went off and drank and picked up women and gambled. And our friend, the rich man, plucked the thorn and went off into the night. The next morning, when the guard came back, the whole of Thorncross had sunk into the ground. Every man, woman, and child had sunk into the ground. There was nothing left. And that the only way we know this story is because that man was able to tell it. He then devoted his life to Christ and became a priest, but we don't know where he went. So that's the story of Thorncross and how it sunk into the ground. A lot of stories about Jesus in this, I have to say. They're all medieval stories, so there we go. When Knighton died, another quick little story. To ensure they stayed safe when the plague came to the island, the people of Knighton escaped, all but one man. So what happened? The plague was ravaging England, ravaging the whole of the British Isles, actually. The Isle of Wight was a bit of a safe haven. But eventually it came. So the people of Knighton decided, because they could see it was coming closer and closer. So the people of Knighton decided, you know what, we're off. And they took off. They thought, well, we can get away from this. Now there's this new place that's been built called New Church. What could be safer than that from the armies of darkness, from the filthy plague that's coming? So they all took off. But there was one guy they didn't quite like. He was old. He didn't really contribute much. He was probably a bit cantankerous. Bit of a weirdo. So they all took off and left him there. And one day, as the plague got closer, a friend just sat outside his house in a chair every evening, and death came. Death came and looked around. He said, "Where is everyone? I've come to deliver the bad news to everyone, and they're gone." Our friend says, "Look, tell you what, if you spare me, I'll tell you where they've gone." Death thought that was a pretty good deal. He said, "Sure." He said, "Well, they've all gone off to New Church. They're all sitting in the green. They've all made up tents up there. Go up there. You can..." And of course, that's what he did. Death went up there and took every single one of them. And left our friend here to live out the rest of his life in what was left of Knighton. Here's the strange thing about that. About 30 years ago, they did an excavation on the green. And they found a mass grave. And that mass grave had twice as many people than it should have. Almost like 2 villages worth of people have been buried on the green where New Church is today. Now, if you go to Knighton, you can actually see where Knighton village used to be. See where the little red dot is there? So when you go where Knighton Gorges is, basically straight across there, if you have a look, you can see where the village of Knighton used to be. Right between that copse and where the rocks is, it's almost dead flat. You can even see where the roads used to be. I like to imagine that's where he sat, just chuckling to himself as death took the rest of those SOBs that had left him there to die. And that's the story of when Knighton died. Truth about Rolin. Another very quick one. We're running out of time here. We've got about 10 minutes left. The cunning folk know that the final resting place of the Holy Grail is the site of Rolin, named of the blood red rose that grew here after sanctifying by the blood of Christ himself. So, Rolin. Story goes that there was a town or a village that was just overrun with the worst kind of people. In fact, they say that the very worst / best prostitutes could be found where Rolin is today. It wasn't called Rolin at the time, but there were cutthroats and bandits and all sorts of people, and they used to hang out there because it was far enough away that the authorities wouldn't go in there. It was covered by trees and was difficult to get to. But also anyone that had money, that's where they'd go. And they say that on the day that Jesus died on the cross, that there was a single bird that came down as he dying on the cross, placed his head near Christ. Jesus blessed the bird and he flew off. And as he flew, he wiped some of Jesus's blood had got on the bird. Now they say that bird then flew from the Holy Land all the way to our little island. And as it flew over this wretched place, that one single drop of Christ's blood fell and sanctified this sinner's den of iniquity. And the whole place burnt to the ground. There's a lot of burning going on. But from that place, a blood red rose grew. And actually, there's still lots of wild roses around there. And when Joseph of Arimathea picked up the Grail and was tasked with hiding it, that bird came back and whispered in his ear and told him of the place that was sanctified. And off he went. Some people think that he went to Scotland. Some people think that he went to another place called Rolin in France. But they're all pretenders to the throne. Because he came here and he hid the Grail there. But he did something very, very sneaky. He placed it in plain sight. But anyone who wants to find it will never be able to see it. So it's still there. Just unfortunately, if you want to find it, you're not going to be able to. And that's the truth about Rolin. Was there a town in Rolin? I don't know.
Where is it on the island?
It is, I guess, officially it's in Newport, I think, or just outside of Newport. I'll show a map and I'll show you where it is. But just look up Rolin Lane, and it's a weird old place, I have to say. Queen Bower and the Devil's Stone. They say it was named for Isabella de Fortibus and her hunting lodge. The old people think it was much more sinister. So we've got about 5 minutes left. I'll tell this story, a very, 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 very quick one. So these stones here are no longer in Queen's Bower or Queen Dower, but they used to be, and they were moved. And these are the 2 remaining devil stones. There were 6 on the island. These are the 2 remaining. There was another one that was at Blackgang and fell into the sea. There was a 4th that was not far from there. It also fell into the sea. There was a holy well there, and it fell into the sea. The other 2 are said to be under the mother church of the Isle of Wight, which is Brading Church. That was said to be the mother church. They said those 2 devil stones sit under there as the foundations. What are the devil stones, and what does that have to do with Queen Dower? So they say that many, many, many years ago, okay, even before Lady Isabella came to the island, they say that there was a queen. I'm not sure where she came from or who she was the queen of or what she was the queen of, but she was a queen. And part of her dowry was this one little part of the island, which was said to have magic. And in the center of it were these 6 stones. And it was said to be so, so special and so magical that there was no price that you could place on it. But those stones weren't known as the devil stones then. They were known as the saint stones. And they say that if you went through the stones, you could be cured of anything. They also said that if ever you climbed all the stones, climbed the stone and sat on the stone, and you sat there for an hour, and you then went to the next one and did the same. After that, 6 hours of sitting on stones, you could summon the devil and he would do your bidding. So they say that this queen, who at the time was a princess, was going to be married off to a prince to become queen, was not too fussed about the said marriage. And while she still retained the stones, the saint stones, she decided to come down one last time. And she decided, you know what, I'm going to try this out. Maybe, just maybe, the devil can stop what was going to happen. So she went and she climbed on the stones and she sat on them for an hour, and she did that. And she did that for 6 hours. And after 6 hours, she sat quietly. And guess what happened? Nothing. Nothing happened. Well, she wasn't too happy about that. She must have done something wrong. So she thought, have a go again. Climbed the stones, sat on the stones, another 6 hours, 12 hours in total. What happened? Nothing happened. So she stood up and she walked away. But as she did, she heard a voice. Princess. She looked around, nothing. Must have been hearing something. She got up and walked. She just kept walking. Princess. Still nothing. Who's there? Nothing. She went to walk. So she finally walked. Princess. The voice changed. Who's there? She called. It's I. You called me. She turned around and there he was. Old Nick in the flesh. What can I do for you? He said, look, not really interested in this marriage. Can you do something about it? He said, your will be done. The deal's a deal, right? You went and sat on those stones. I'll do what you asked me to do. So he said, sit down and I will make it happen. The devil then ran around the stones and ran around the stones and ran around the stones faster and faster and faster, faster and faster and faster, heating them up faster and faster and faster until finally he ran round and hit them all and they fell on the princess and killed her. And that was him doing his part of the deal. And the story goes that when word got out what had happened, the prince then came down and pulled out the stones and scattered them across the island so they'd never be used again for nefarious purposes. And that, my friends, is the story of where we get the name Queen Bower and why we have the devil's stones. So they're the two remaining ones. Or you could try digging up under Brading Church, but I don't know that they'd be too happy about that.
Why do they call it Queen Bower?
Because it was her dowry. It was her dowry. It was so, it was said to be so, there was no money that could buy the blessings that you would get from that place, but it doesn't sound that great to me. So that is it. Thank you very much for coming. Does anyone have any questions?